Good afternoon, everyone. As we get started with today's event, here are a few rules for engagement. We ask to reduce background noise that participants please be sure to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. We don't mind if you should keep your video on. In fact, we'd love to see your faces. Additionally, in the unlikely event that this Zoom meeting is compromised by an outside entity, the host of this meeting will close the session and send all participants a new link to resume. During the Q&A portion of the event, the moderator will give instructions. You will be able to ask questions using the chat function or be able to ask your questions live by using the raise your hand feature, and the moderator will call on you when it's your turn to ask your question. Now, I will turn this over to Dr. Winsome Chinu, Director of Ohio's Multicultural Center, for welcome remarks and to get us started.
Thank you, Dwayne. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Winsome Chinu. I'm the director of the Multicultural Center, as well as the Black Student Cultural Programming Board. And on behalf of our center, the Division of Diversity and Inclusion, I would like to welcome you all and thank you all for being here today. I am also seeing some of my former colleagues from OU who are at other institutions on the presentation right now, and I want to thank you and welcome you all. So, Native American Heritage Month. This information comes courtesy of the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the U.S. Department of Interior. What started at the turn of the century as an effort to gain a day of recognition for the significant contributions to the first Americans made to the establishment and growth of the United States has resulted in a whole month being designated for that purpose. One of the very proponents of an American Indian Day was Dr. Arthur C. Parker, a Seneca Indian, who was the director of the Museum of Arts and Science in Rochester, New York. He actually persuaded the Boy Scout of America to set aside a day for the first Americans. For 3 years, they adopted such a day. Eventually, in 1915, the annual Congress of the American Indian Association, at their meeting in Lawrence, Kansas, formally approved a plan concerning American Indian heritage, American Indian Day. It directed its president, Reverend Sherman Coolidge, an Arapaho Indian, to call upon the country to observe such a day. Coolidge issued a proclamation on September 28, 1915, which declared the second Saturday of each May as an American Indian Day and contained the first formal appeal for recognition of Indians as citizens. The year before this proclamation was issued, Red Fox James, a Blackfoot Indian, rode on horseback from state to state seeking approval for a day to honor Indians. On December 14th, 1915, he presented the endorsements of 24 state governments at the White House. There is no record, however, of such a national day being proclaimed. The first American Indian Day in a state was declared on the second Saturday in May 1916 by the governor of New York. Several states celebrate the fourth Friday in September. In Illinois, for example, legislators enacted such a day in 1919. Presently, several states have designated Columbus Day as Native American Day, but it continues to be a day we observe without any recognition as a national legal holiday. However, in 1990, President George H.W. Bush approved a joint resolution designating November 1990 National American Indian Heritage Month. Similar proclamations under variant names included Native American Heritage Month, National American Indian and Alaskan Heritage Month have been issued since the year actually 1994. Once again, thank you all for coming and for being so anxious to hear our speaker today, Anton Treuer. Anton is a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University, and he's the author of 9 books. His equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path of service around the region, the nation, and the world. Everything you wanted to know about Indians, but you were afraid to ask: cultural competency and equity, tribal sovereignty, Ojibwe language and culture. He has a bachelor's degree from Princeton, a master's and a Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota, 40+ prestigious awards and fellowship, including the American Philosophical Society, National Endowment for the Arts, the National Science Foundation, the Bush Foundation, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. Everyone on this presentation right now, please help me welcome Dr. Anton Treuer as Ohio University's 2020 speaker for our American Indian Heritage Month speaker. Dr. Treuer.
Hey, thank you, Winsome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Koe nui Ojibwe majines mietago windamunagug awian wagosh hindagu minawa migizi and odem gazagasqua jime kagishinakade ishkonigan wenjabayan. Just wanted to give you a brief greeting in my Ojibwe language, to add that my native name is Wagush, which means fox. I come from the Eagle clan, and I'm from Leech Lake, which is in northern Minnesota. So here it is on the map. I'm mainly interested in fielding your questions today, but to kind of set us up, I wanted to share a couple of things with you as we get started. First of all, I'm very aware, as I get to do a lot of public speaking, that when I do even something as simple as introduce myself in my Indigenous language, people often stare at each other and wonder, what foreign language was that? And it's always weird to me that an Indigenous language sounds and seems foreign. I think at the university where I work, Bemidji State University in northern Minnesota, I just about have the president and deans convinced that when someone calls to ask for the Department of Foreign Languages, that we should send them to the English department instead, but it's a work in progress. And I think these are very interesting and challenging times. In the history of humans, democracy, for example, is a pretty new way to structure a society. And it's obviously getting a really big test right now. And to me, even though the American experiment has been in many ways a colonial experiment, taking one culture and using it to supplant and erase others, that the real test of our democracy will not be our ability to assimilate everybody into one monoculture, but our ability to not just tolerate, but genuinely support all kinds of linguistic, racial, and cultural diversity. And we got a lot of work to do to help everyone figure out how to get along and to make democracy really work for everybody and provide opportunity equitably for everybody. And these are things, I think, on the minds of a lot of Americans. And within the Native experience, I think something quite important to all of us, even though the Indigenous experience has some things that are very unique to it. As we get started here too, this is an image of Tom Stillday. He's an elder from the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. And I see there's a comment here Yes, I've got this set up in presenter mode rather than just a straight up slideshow. And that's on purpose because I'm really only going to present for a few minutes and then we're going to be fielding questions. And so I've got stuff that I can use to help answer questions. But in any event, Tom Stillday, who you see on the image here, was the first person who was named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate who was not from one of the Abrahamic traditions. So that was him with his pipe opening up the state Senate. And he had a great sense of humor too, because he'd say, "I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it." And I couldn't help but think how prescient that thought was. But he had a lot of great ways of framing things. I had him up to give a keynote address for a graduation banquet for Native students at our university. Told him to keep it short and tell a couple good jokes, focus on the students. I think he spoke for about an hour and a half, and it was all in Ojibwe. He didn't use a word of English until he was all done. And he said, "All you people who study Indians, study that." And he went and sat down. So I was so entertained by his perspective. But so often, the books out there on Native people have been written by non-Native people who haven't really spent a lot of time even talking to Native people. And for sources, they'll use what the white army officer wrote in his journal or something like that. And so when it comes to not just historical events, but economic development, the suicide prevention plan, the school turnaround plan, oftentimes what happens is that folks from outside of those communities come in and say, "We know better than you, what's best for you." And they're even using data sets for completely different groups of people. No surprise, they often get it wrong. I'll give you just a minute or two on me because that will help frame our discussion. None of us sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all different. So here are a couple of folks in my family tree. And I think one of the definitions or one of the defining attributes of indigeneity is connection to place. Most Americans, whether it was voluntary or involuntary or under duress, had a process of disconnecting from motherland, mother tongue, mother culture, and oftentimes struggle trying to hold on to those things, swimming in the sea of American culture. And it's a special challenge, especially for recent immigrants, as one of the greatest predictors of the language and culture of children is not the language and culture of their parents, but the language and culture of their peers. And this is just part of the human experience. For Native people, however, there wasn't a choice, a trade-off that somebody picked to, risk disconnecting from those things so that we could have a piece of sweet American apple pie. It was something that was kind of foisted upon us. And for me, my relatives are still buried in the same place that they have been longer than America's been a country. And it feels different, that connection to place. And also the connection to ancestors. I think most Americans, know their parents and grandparents and might know the names of their great-grandparents, but beyond that, might not know their names or even where they're buried. And so it just plays a little differently. In some ways, we even celebrate the freedom in America to have a malleable identity. Like if you get a job in California, move and become Californian. And for Native people, it often feels a little different. I feel a tether to my home community. And it's one of the reasons I stay in northern Minnesota, even though I've kind of been a hotshot professor who's published a pile of books and gets asked to take jobs in other places. I'm a servant in my community. I officiate at a lot of our ceremonies, funerals, things like that. I'm an academic person, but I also do a lot of this community work. And in addition to that, of course, I got all the grandparents for my kids within 10 minutes of the front door and our kind of traditional cultural space, that's just really important. On the left side of the screen with this very ancient face is a guy who ironically got the name John Smith, no connection to the one from Pocahontas legend. He was born in Minnesota in the 1700s, and he died in the 1900s. So he was there before white settlement, and he was still there when they were sending people off to World War I. Kind of incredible, the changes that he saw in his lifetime. On the other side of the screen there, Wabujig, kind of a famous Ojibwe warrior. And I guess as I went to school, I didn't really have the tools to talk about it, but it bothered me as I got older that I could go to school for 13 years in a row to learn what I was supposed to learn to be successful in the world, but none of it had anything to do with me. And the message from good-hearted people who actually cared about me and my opportunities, the message that was administered not through overt mean acts of racism, but simply through absent narratives. The message was, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. And I reacted to that as many people would when they feel assaulted. It's like fight, flight, freeze. And even, I'm not alone in that experience. I think for Native students and for students of color broadly, you see a basket of predictable outcomes. And, the base result is, the professionals are scratching their heads going, how come we have a truancy problem with these students of color? And I'm like, flight. How come we have discipline problems with these students? I'm like, fight. How come some of these students are spaced out, zoned out, not engaged with what the teacher's doing? And I'm like, freeze. And they're predictable responses. So here are my folks. My father's not Native at all. He's actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant. He was a Holocaust survivor. He spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. He has an amazing story of his own, but eventually made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mother grew up in a little village called Bena in the heart of the Leech Lake Reservation. And the economic situation in Bena is still pretty sobering. If you haven't had a chance, I'd recommend a great TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, as she talks about the danger of a single story. So even in the Native experience, as I share this much about my mother's experience, you will hear stereotypes that Natives are all living in squalor on reservations. You will also hear stereotypes that they're all rich from casinos. Try to reconcile those two stereotypes, and you can't do it. And the reason is each is a single story narrative that tells you one tiny little piece of what's happening with one tiny group of people. I mean, if I took a picture of poverty in white communities in Appalachia, everyone would be shaking their heads saying, oh, those poor people. But if you take a picture of the white experience on the Upper East Side, in Manhattan, you'd have a totally different picture. And both realities are real and part of the white experience. And so too with the Native experience, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And we're going to have a chance to ask questions and talk about that today. As my folks were getting started, I guess you could say my dad was hitting the restart button. My mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. There were some humble beginnings. I remember kerosene lanterns and no electricity, outhouse, no running water. We had a little hand pump, and we'd wash up in the creek in the summer, and we'd have enamel wash basins in the winter. I never felt poor. Those are actually quite happy memories. As I got older, though, by the time I hit middle school, my mother became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota, built a nice house, and the economic profile for our family changed a lot. To me, it revealed the power of an education, and it's undeniable. At the same time, I'm kind of with George Carlin on this. We call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. There are barriers out there, and the barriers are not equitably distributed. In fact, they're predictably inequitably distributed by gender, race, and a whole host of other variables. At the same time, that having an education is no guarantee, that you're going to get the kind of job you want. It's a lever that improves your chances significantly. And certainly I see its power and have seen it happen in my folks' lives. That's my crew. I have 9 kids. I got 3 grandkids. It is never dull. Someday I'll actually do a book on managing this mob because it's pretty fun. And I'm happy as we get into questions to talk about my personal experience as well as my academic work and perspectives on current events and so forth. There's a view off the front deck of my house. I kind of feel like Shrek sometimes. That's my swamp. But among other things in this picture, and one of the reasons I just love living where I do, when my folks were getting started, my dad had put in a bid on a piece of tax forfeited property, got a letter back saying your bid wasn't enough to cover the delinquent taxes. Could you find a couple $100 extra, which he did. And he got a big chunk of property for relatively little money. At one point, it had been a virgin white pine forest that had been clear cut and it was all turned into farm fields. So when he got it, it was all fields. And he started planting trees. He planted all of the trees in this picture. It totally transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. And that was one dude with a child labor force. And it made such a profound change. And to me, when I think about the big issues that we have to face, like climate change, race relations, a lot of us look at those things and think, holy crap, there's not much I can do about it. I'll try to be a decent human being and I'll tell my kids to be decent human beings. And I hope that's enough, but it's never enough. All that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. And so ultimately, it's not like we got to take this mountain of problems that humans have been creating for thousands of years and like move that whole mountain today. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds and it can transform the landscape and the entire ecosystem. And that's the work. That's the work in race relations. That's the work in education. That's the work in climate change too. Our family does a lot of stuff like this. We harvest wild rice, hunt, fish, gather. But I'm also an academic person who kind of travels the world and does a lot of public speaking. I'll skip over these next couple of slides just to get to your questions a little bit faster. But I sometimes use this analogy, like if I hold up my finger and say, what is that? I could start a fight unless we clarified what language I'm using to talk about it. Like, in the language of body parts, that is indeed a finger. But in the language of numbers, that's a 1. And in the language of space, that's up. So who's right? And obviously, they're all right. It's a matter of perspective, context, language. And here's what happens when we tackle tough topics like race relations. All too often, somebody's up there saying, this here's a finger. It's not an elbow. It's not a toe. The rest of you, shh. And someone's listening going, pff. That's a 1, not a 2, not a 3. See, they just don't understand. And we totally miss each other. So it's really, really powerful when we can see that as a finger and a 1 and up and all the other many things that it is. And that's what it means to have those multiple perspectives. And when we get good at it, to be multicultural. And it is so valuable. It's valuable if you ever want to be in a marriage. It's valuable if you want to raise kids. It's valuable if you want to work in a workplace that has more than one group of humans represented. And incredibly important for us to advance these important agendas. All right, so I'll just share one final piece kind of about my, my most recent books. I had actually written Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians, but were afraid to ask several years ago. And I've got a new edition coming out actually for young readers that'll be coming out here in a couple of months. And I kind of stumbled onto this particular project a bit by accident. I think by the time I had finished high school, my goal was to get the heck out of Dodge and never come back. In fact, I had some kind of rugged, even overt, racially violent experiences when I was in high school. And I thought, I'm going to get away from that crap and I am never coming back. And then of course, as soon as I left, I was like, man, I want to go home and never leave. And my perspective started to change. As a student at Princeton University, I got homesick, even though I had a great experience there. And at one point I heard that there was this Comanche spiritual leader coming to Princeton, which is in New Jersey, to run sweat lodge ceremonies. And I thought, I was a little naive, but I was just smart enough to know, the Comanche come from Texas and Oklahoma, and there are Fruit Loops and crazy people out there, and maybe this was one. But I was also really eager, for a cultural experience, some affinity space. So I went out there, and it might have been 4 or 5 in the afternoon. The sun was up. There was about 20 white folk waiting for the sweat lodge ceremony, and they were all completely naked. And I remember thinking, kind of mixed feelings. So part of me really wanted to laugh because, dang, there are 20 naked people standing around in the woods in the broad daylight. Like, what else can you do? Part of me, kind of wanted to run because, dang, there are 20 naked people standing around in the woods. And part of me was also really mad, like, dang, is that what they think we are all about? Get naked, dance around a fire, And, but being naive, I opened the car door, I got out, and I was immediately folded into a tight embrace by one of these completely naked strangers who's hugging me hard and saying, I'm so sorry what my people did to your people. So now it's like, awkward. And now the desire to like laugh, run, get mad is just growing. And I looked at this person's face. She was an elder, and there were tears welling up in her eyes. And I realized that no matter how misguided she was, and yes, she was misguided, that her emotional response was actually real. And that if I just got angry, she would be thinking the only Native person she ever met was a angry Indian. And if she, if I walked away, she'd keep on thinking what she was thinking. And so I had to think fast. And I said, you know what, could you put some clothes on? Because I'd love to talk to you about all of this. And she did. And we actually had a really good conversation. And through the course of that, I think she came away with a little different perspective, but in a weird way, I did too. And among the things that I learned was how important it is to make safe space and to say, you can ask questions and you won't get an angry rebuke. You'll get my best effort at a meaningful response. And in that diplomatic approach, I really found a way to advance important efforts much more effectively. So that's how I got started with everything you wanted to know about Indians, but were afraid to ask. I started collecting questions and I started hunting for answers. I went to the same kind of school most Americans did. I got a sugar-coated version of Chris Columbus and the first Thanksgiving. And then as I did so, I started hunting for the answers that I never got when I was going to high school. And sometimes that took a lot of work, but it was really exciting and fulfilling for me as I hunted for the answers. And initially I was thinking non-Native people are going to need this stuff, right? But I was really surprised how many Native people were really excited about the work too, because they were getting bombarded by the same questions. And as they were doing that, then they didn't always get the answers on a silver platter either. So I'll say that much. I have tons of stuff loaded and ready to share with you, and I'm ready to start fielding some of your questions. You can ask about anything that you want to, and we can talk about what just happened in the most recent election and how Native votes were critical in swing election states. We can talk about mascots and what is just ongoing right now as the formerly known Washington Redskins hunt for a different name. We can talk about pipelines. We can talk about history, Indigenous language revitalization, culture, whatever is of interest to you, what's going on in education, what's going on with our democracy, you name it. You can go wherever you want. We'll never finish a conversation like that today. We'll just get it started. But I'm really excited to take as many questions as we can with the time we have. You can start dropping them into the chat, or you can go ahead and start chirping them out. There aren't too many of us on the call, and we should be able to manage. Who wants to get us started?
Anton, I think I'll go ahead, and I'm glad you talked about the recent election, because there have been several articles written about the Navajo vote, specifically in Arizona and New Mexico, and what that meant, that somewhere the tune of 95% of the Navajo Nation voted for Biden, and that they were excited about the plan that the Biden-Harris team put forward for Native people. And the thought is that that may be the reason that triggered the large turnout. What do you think? And also, sort of historically, politically, if you could kind of quickly with that answer talk about how Native peoples around this country, including other people of culture, have somehow been left behind by the political system and that conversation. Mm-hmm. But then we tend to be the ones who, particularly within the Democratic Party, come out, vote, support, etc., and what that means.
Right. So, both of these things are really, they're kind of connected. So, Native people always had their own political systems. We pre-existed the United States of America. And even when America came into being, Native nationhood had not just pre-existed, but survived throughout the American experience and continues to exist now. Of course, it's changed. Of course, there's been a colonial experience. And for some Native communities, they endured not just an American colonial effort, but one with the British or the French or the Spanish, or in places like Alaska with the Russians. And, all of those experiences had deep impacts on Native people. And the founding ideals of America, about freedom and justice for all, were really at odds with the founding reality that we were talking about equality for white male property owners and who owned slaves. So of course, the founding practice was not in alignment with those founding ideals. At the same time, America has grown and shifted, and there are watershed times like women's suffrage in 1920, civil rights movement, where we saw an expansion of the polity and the concepts and so forth. Native people have had an interesting relationship with that. So, the Citizenship Act for Native people wasn't passed until 1924. So it's even after the women's suffrage movement that citizenship was extended to all Native people. And citizenship does not equal suffrage. So it's really not until the 1970s, it's even after we've started passing like the Voting Rights Act to deal with Jim Crow, that Native people are even afforded the opportunity in a state like Arizona, which had pretty strict voter suppression laws for Native people. And there's the window opened. Even then, Native people don't always lean into the American political process. They're like, why would I participate in the colonial experiment? I'm a member of a Native nation. And that thinking has shifted and changed. So I'd say most Native people would say, I'm a dual citizen. I'm a member of my Native nation and I'm a member of the United States of America, both. And there are also lots of Natives who are not enrolled members of their own Native nation, but still have a strong cultural and identity affinity with those Native spaces. So that's been changing. Now, specifically within the policy front and American political elections and what happened most recently, the Native the rate of Native participation in American politics has been growing and growing. I know, like in states like Arizona and Minnesota, Native voter turnout has been high, and has been high really 20 years or so, even higher than the general population in many places. Red Lake just had a 93% voter turnout. And going back the last 4 election cycles, if you removed the Native vote, you would have different results in the state elections, and who is senator and things like that. And then we saw this happen in Arizona most recently. If you remove the Native vote, Arizona clearly goes for Trump as opposed to Biden. So that says something pretty significant. But this particular election cycle, also had some things that were very, very specific to it. The Native population is diverse, and they're diverse politically and culturally. So, just like all Black people don't always vote Democrat, even though you can see, a much higher percentage of that population that does, it's important to acknowledge not all Native people vote Democrat either. And especially in states like Oklahoma, where the Native population is quite large, but also predominantly Baptist and Methodist in the heart of the Bible Belt, you'll find a fair number of Native people who, find the family values parts of the Republican Party platform really important to them and vote that way. But I think on the policy front, for the most part, the Republican Party has been somewhat resistant to policy things that will strengthen tribal sovereignty. So I won't give you every example, but I'll give you one. There's a piece of legislation called the Violence Against Women Act. There's an issue where tribes have jurisdiction over tribal members on tribal land. And the sexual assault rate for women in America is 25%. For Native women, though, it's twice that. It's 50%, 50. And where most crime in America is white on white and black on black and so forth, crimes of sexual violence perpetrated on Native women are predominantly perpetrated by white men. And so as a result, if a white dude comes onto the res and rapes a Native woman, the tribe wouldn't have authority to prosecute him for that crime. So the Violence Against Women Act was designed to deal with this, jurisdictional issue. And it's a piece of legislation that requires reauthorization on a regular basis. And the Republican Party has consistently stymied and held up reauthorization of VAWA. So if you're concerned about that issue, missing and murdered Indigenous women and so forth, or if you have an experience as 50% of Native women do, this is very personal and painful. And so why would you vote for the party that is not even going to help protect you, right? So that mobilizes people to vote. And there are a host of other related issues. When you look at just the culture stuff that's been going on, this last election was mainly about Trump. If you take only people of color voting, that's what the vote looks like. All 50 states go for Biden if it's only people of color voting. If it's only white people voting, all but a tiny handful of states go for Trump. And when you break that down, by any number of other measures, you see huge, huge divisions. If it's just white men who vote, it's 4 states, And so this is a very divisive time. And, I think the gender and racial issues, you don't need me to explain them to you. They're pretty obvious. People have strong feelings both ways. But that has helped mobilize a lot of people to vote. And I think I'm frustrated that the Republican Party platform, for the most part, has used its strategy to suppress votes. Like when Democrats vote, when people vote, Democrats win. And so making it harder for people to vote rather than coming up with ideas that will make them want to vote for you is not a long-term winning strategy, but it's one that has kind of dominated the American political experience. Time for a change. All right, I see lots of questions popping up in the chat here. So
Okay, Anton, so
Yeah.
what I want to do is combine two of the questions
All
because
right.
so there is one question asking what's the best way to be an ally, and then one asking about terminology and being respectful and what kind of terms non-native should use when speaking about and to Native communities. So if we could combine, that would be great. And then the other one I want to go to is the impact of COVID on the Native communities. And then we'll get to the other ones.
Okay. So with regard to terminology, this is an unsettled question and not all Native people agree. Just as the Black community's gone round and around, is it Black, is it African American? Do we find a more inclusive label with people of color, but don't use colored people? And it's hard to know exactly what to use. It's a little bit contextual. It's like that within the Native space too. You probably have caught on that I'm using a lot of them somewhat interchangeably. Indigenous, Native American, First Nation. And I think for the most part, Indigenous and Native or Native American tend to be a little more politically correct. But there are big groups, National Congress of American Indians, American Indian Movement, that have said, no, use American Indian. I think for myself, I'd love for us to have a productive, inclusive national conversation and do what they did in Canada, where they eventually came up with something for them, First Nation, that speaks to indigeneity and nationhood. It's clear, it's not too many syllables, but we haven't gotten there. So for me, I use them all as a means of kind of making safe space. But in the long run, I'd love for us to get to Native Nation or something like that, that kind of provides clarity and simplicity and so forth. With regard to these other questions, COVID, and remind me again, Winsome, what was the one that was before that you wanted me to jump on?
Being an ally, how can
Being an ally,
how can
yes.
people be, yes, what are some things that people can do to help the community?
Yeah, it's a really critical question. How can I help? How can I make a difference? So first of all, we are all dealing with a long history of oppression. And oppression dehumanizes everybody, not just the victims of oppression, but the perpetrators too. Violence dehumanizes everyone. Look at our, we just had Veterans Day yesterday. Look what happens with our men and women in uniform who win their wars and still often have horrible psychological trauma from the violence. I like the Lila Watson quote. She's an Australian Aboriginal scholar. And she says, if you've come here simply to help me, then it's not going to work. But if you've come here because you can see that your liberation is tied up with my liberation, then let's begin. So the first thing I would say is, working on racial equity and things like that, it's not an act of charity. It's something that elevates everyone's humanity, and we all have a stake in this. Second of all, for the practical parts, like how do we do it? When working across, like in mixed company, and trying to advance an issue that is, focused on a group that is not your own, it's really helpful to listen to the self-stated goals of that particular group. So rather than kind of having a Jesus complex, then it's more important to say, okay, what do you need? How can I help do it? Let me do that, and also oftentimes, to advance like in the racial equity world, there are some kinds of work we need to do in mixed company where we're hearing the multiple perspectives and experiences and things like that. And there's also work that needs to happen within our own affinity space. So for a white person who's been working at this and reading books and talking to people and feels like you got some handle on the basic concepts, sometimes some of the bigger work is actually talking to other white people and recruiting them to the conversation and moving them into action and things like that. And oftentimes, some of the work for me as a Native person is working with other Native people. And there's also a value to the kind of work I do in mixed company. They both matter. So we have to have an adaptive leadership approach where we're listening while leading. And it's not about an act of charity, but it's about really transforming the way we do things. Also, I think especially for white Americans, like everything we do is a racial experience. Like we're impacted by race 100% of the time. And oftentimes there's this tendency, especially in white space, to think that racial experiences are only negative, and I don't have those too much. But frankly, it is a racial experience every time someone is racially profiled, but it's also a racial experience every time someone is not racially profiled. The difference is if you are racially profiled, you usually have a pretty good idea that's what's happening. And if you're not, there's no big sign, memo, something that says, hey, you were just not racially profiled. And so it doesn't penetrate the consciousness the same way. And so a lot of times it's really important to look into the blind spots, to develop some sonar to navigate these waters, which means sound waves going out and sound waves coming back, conversation with many different people, so you can see this stuff more effectively. And that will equip people to be a change agent. And then it takes some bravery. So oftentimes one of the messages to be an effective ally means to be brave, to have some skin in the game, to be willing to accept risk, not even allyship so much as being an accomplice, that I am willing, and by risk, I don't mean like risk in your life, but I mean, how many times have we all swallowed a spoonful of racism to keep peace at the Thanksgiving dinner table because someone's going off, And so it takes a certain measure of bravery to say, hey, grandma, no, you got that one wrong, and so that's not easy for people. And I realize it's not easy, but that's where a lot of the work is. With regard to the COVID experience, it's been pretty rough. In fact, it's still rough right now. I know a number of people from our Indigenous community here who have died from COVID, and the rates are pretty high. There are a lot of issues going on. Navajo Nation got a lot of attention, but they're not the only Native community that's been having a disproportionately high and negative experience with COVID. There are a lot of drivers for that. For a long time, the additional funding that was to go to tribes for the public health outlay was embargoed for the first 6 months of the COVID crisis. And so it was very difficult to get information and to get, PPE sent out to Native communities, ventilators, these kind of things. It was even harder to get it there. Also, for a lot of places, like, if you're living in the center of Navajo Nation and you don't have running water, then the protocol for like even hand washing is also somewhat challenged by those circumstances. And sometimes you got many people living in the same house. And so those crowded conditions also, affect things. And some of this is, there's an intersectionality with poverty and race. And we're finding out other things too, that are, and we'll probably learn a lot more about this as time goes on, but a number of these things are impacting the, the predictability of COVID in Native communities. Today, I would say things are improving in terms of information and access to ventilators and PPE, even at IHS clinics and things like that. But I don't know, in the upper Midwest, holy cow, I mean, they're at capacity with most of the hospitals and clinics right now. And we're pretty concerned about where that goes from here. So I think it's important that we take this seriously. And it's been kind of disheartening to see all the anti-mask, kind of stuff, like, people have, first of all, just ignored science and pretended like this is not going to hurt them. And then have also adopted the view that if it's not going to hurt me, then to heck with everybody else. And so I think it's time that we really think about one another and do some common sense response on COVID.
Absolutely. So Anton, one question that's a one-word answer because we have so many other ones that I would like to get to, and we have 4 minutes. And just so you all know that Anton can have where we can go on for a little bit after, but I want to be respectful because I know some people join during their lunch hour. What age group is your book catered to?
Yeah, so there's an adult version, on the one side of the screen, and then the kid one is really kind of engineered for middle and high school. Yeah,
Okay.
and the thing that, also with that one, we expanded the range of topics. So there's just a lot has been happening in social activism even over the past 5 years. We had, DAPL and, all the COVID stuff and so forth. A lot of other environmental activism. There was that stuff at the Lincoln Memorial, during the Right to Life March and so forth. And so, yeah, so even the range of topics has really been expanded for that one.
Awesome, thank you. And I also want to go back to when you talked about the Violence Against Women Act, and that I am hoping that people recognize that you shared that for Native women, it's twice the rate as other women, every other group in the United States, and that most of those acts are committed by white males.
Yeah.
And that you do not necessarily have jurisdiction on the reservation, and that because I'm looking at the people who are here, and I know, and several of them I know are people who are passionate about this. So just in case they came on late and missed that, I wanted to go back and reiterate that. So of course we have questions about the mascots, but before that, maybe you could quickly, and you've talked about this a little bit already, but quickly say something about Tess is saying that she's been struggling with how to support racial justice for Black Americans, and at the same time advocating for recognition and inclusion of Native people. And if you have any thoughts about how to go about info about what about isms, and any thoughts.
Yeah.
And then I want to get to some of the other questions, because I know you answered some of that already, but if you could quickly say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to get to mascots.
Yeah. All right. So we'll do everything we can on this call, and whatever we can't, I drop my my website into the chat window there. I got free resources for educators. There's lists of events, info on the books. And so just happy to sustain a conversation. So I'll give a couple minutes on Black Lives Matter and the value of Native lives within that context.
Yes.
So first of all, it's just not as safe out there for people of color when they interact with police as it is for white folk. And, the data is showing that it's especially unsafe for Black and brown folks. Some studies are showing that, Native males are the most endangered when dealing with police. I think it's important to be aware that there is an issue that happens within any oppressed group with competing victimization and an oppression Olympics. And if we spend our energy fighting with each other, then we are going to miss advancing the war against oppression. And so it's difficult to speak to the value of Native lives without somehow undermining or being at war with the message that Black Lives Matter, because it is the invisibility of that part of the narrative that is part of one of the drivers for the outcomes. And a lot of the data is saying it is dangerous out there being a Native person. So first of all, just with regard to Black Lives Matter, it doesn't say only Black Lives Matter. It doesn't say Black Lives Matter more than other lives. And a lot of people, frankly, just don't read. They're imputing meaning that is not there. Second of all, the response, don't tell me Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, is basically code for shut up, right? It's like if someone says Jesus matters and someone says all gods matter. It's not because they're really talking about the value of all gods. It's because they're trying to say shut up, right? And so I see this picture when someone says, don't tell me Black lives matter, all lives matter. We can't do that, right? Like if you had a house fire and you called 911 and said, help, my house is on fire, you should never have to hear, don't tell me your house matters, all houses matter. This one's on fire. We should all answer the call, right? And at the same time, it is tough to like provide sufficiently ample oxygen to the conversation around the value of other lives. And it's incumbent upon us to find better ways to do that. I think it's really improving and growing. And I saw at, the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, lots of people from Black Lives Matter were there in solidarity. And when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, Native people were in the streets in droves, speaking to the value of Black lives. And this is some of the most important part of the work, that we cannot just lean in when it affects me. We have to lean in across the board because the oppression affects all of us. And so I think we do have to, all of us find the best ways to do that so we don't have to look at data sets like that, right? And this is like, look at the longevity for a Native man in North Dakota, 54.7 years. And they tell you to save money for retirement and stuff like that. And across the board, we're looking at, chronic liver disease as an indicator of substance abuse, but also diabetes, unintentional injuries, homicide, self-harm and suicide, just disproportionately impacting those communities. And so, I think it is important that whenever there's a call coming out, that we all find the right ways to answer it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And mascots, can you say a little bit about the question from Sean Lewis is how you feel about mascots, and is there a general consensus?
There is probably more of a consensus in the Native community, although not all Native people think and feel the same way. So, I fundamentally believe that we would do a lot better if we just got rid of human mascots, stuck with lions, tigers, and bears. Ultimately, our sports culture has the potential to actually be one of those unifying cultural experiences where we can all go cheer for the Packers or whatever, right? But I think, there are kind of two main defenses of mascots. One is we pick this mascot to honor you because, you got badass Spartans and Trojans and Redskins, and that it wasn't to denigrate. But when you look at the imagery, like Chief Wahoo, does he look like me? No, it's caricature. When you look at, people, are they doing this to honor me, or are they kind of just playing Halloween? And they're probably just playing Halloween. And also, it's not just the hometown fans, but opposing fans always defile their opponent's mascots in the name of team spirit. And so there's no way to stop this stuff, hanging Indians in effigy, tomahawk chops and war whoops, high school teams, with a name like the Indians, and the opposing fans are saying, hey, Indians, get ready to leave in a trail of tears round two. Hi, how are ya? Hi, how are ya? Kind of stuff. Or here's another high school, that's got they're going to go play the Indians. So it's scalp the Indians and a stagecoach and an Indian in effigy with the dynamite, and these kind of things, like, especially for schools, somewhere in, the mission, it's going to say something about inclusive learning environment. So why do things that are inimical to learning and inimical to inclusion? And, you know, the other kind of defense will be, well, I found a Native person who said it doesn't bother them at all. And I would say, but there are a lot of people who do. Like there's a country music song by Gretchen Wilson, Redneck Woman. I don't know if you ever heard that. I'm a redneck woman, I ain't no high class broad. Does
I'm
that
just a product of my raising. I say, hey, y'all, and hee-haw.
Right. Does that mean I get to say, call every white woman I meet redneck woman? Probably not. Might somebody be offended? Probably so. And I can't just say, well, Gretchen Wilson's down with that, so your view doesn't matter, right? We have to listen to people from that group. And if it is seriously offensive to somebody, no, let's not go there. And over 100 tribes have passed resolutions repudiating the use of Native imagery and mascots. The National Congress of American Indians has passed a resolution repudiating their use. And that overwhelms and outweighs the Florida Seminole who said you can use our tribe's name. And, you know, the Meskwaki from Iowa who said you can use the name Black Hawk for the hockey team. And I'm not saying they don't have a right to say what they want and view. We just don't have the right to force everyone to swallow a spoonful of racism every time they want to participate in our sports culture. And ultimately, with so many other positive choices out there, like lions, tigers, and bears, let's do that.
Thank you. So so there are two others that I want to get to, and then there's one from Kat that is really long. So Sarah is asking about Thanksgiving, and since we're coming up on the Thanksgiving holiday, and I usually post a lot about this on Facebook, on social media in general during.
Oh, you hit the mute button, Winsome. Halfway through.
Oh, thank you, Anton. So yeah. I often post a lot on social media during this time about Thanksgiving and what that means. So if you'd comment really quickly on the history and why it's critical for us to think about that, as well as there is a question from KS about nativeness regarding Elizabeth Warren and how much in terms of DNA or blood makes you native or not. So like within the Black community, we have this narrative around if you're Black enough. And so what makes one native enough? And then the other piece is have people critically reflect on Thanksgiving and what that means. And then I think after that, I'm going to take one more because that's the only time that we have.
Okay. So with regard to Thanksgiving, I mean, I get a couple days off and I usually spend it with my family too. But at the same time, when you look at the history behind this, to me, there is this cloaking of American exceptionalism that is being shoved at us and ignores the historical reality. So there are parts of that Thanksgiving mythology that have some truth, but there's a lot that's highly distorted. So, you know, the first boatload of pilgrims who showed up, the very first act that they did was to come into a native village where everyone just ran away because they were scared of the newcomers and stole their food. It was an act of theft. America was densely occupied by other people. It wasn't scattered bands of roaming nomads with room for everyone who came. Those who came made room by displacing the people who were already living there. And there's no way around that. The displacement was usually very violent. So while Native people did share at times some food and some ideas about how to farm in this land, the first evidence of a shared Native white harvest celebration occurred many years after the first boatload of pilgrims. And it wasn't long until you had, you know, the Wampanoag subjected to a genocidal war. The so-called King Philip of the Wampanoag, who had welcomed the pilgrims and formed peace and actually broke bread with them. He was killed. His head was put on a pike at the village of Plymouth, where it stayed for 20 years. His wife and children were sold into slavery and sent to the Indies to work on sugarcane plantations. So if that doesn't jive with the Thanksgiving narrative you heard, it's time to read a book, read an article, get some more information, and understand more about this, the real history of this particular event. With regard to pedigree and authenticity and indigeneity, a couple of things. First of all, identity is complex, and even race is complex. There are pedigree issues in every racial group when it comes to how we accept or out and marginalize one another. At the same time, to me, race is kind of three things. So it's partially about color, right? Like if I say for a white guy like me, it's hard to understand because people would say, wait, what? Even though I'm just as white as I am Native, right? So color shows up, and that's how we get racially profiled. Like you could actually take a Black Dominican who speaks Spanish, a Black Haitian who speaks French Creole, and an African American who speaks English, and they're all going to get racially profiled the same way because of color. But when they open their mouths and start talking, then culture starts to matter a lot, right? And maybe that Black Dominican has a little more affinity with a Spanish speaker, of a totally different race because of culture things. And then race is also partially about our consciousness. It's how we see ourselves. A lot of us are racially diverse, multiracial, and culturally complex too. With regard to who's a real Indian and who's not, there are a couple of levels to this. For me, and I'm somebody who officiates at ceremonies, and I'm a gatekeeper, we just do these ceremonies for Native people. We don't require a tribal enrollment card. If you are, you have Native blood in your DNA, it can be anywhere from 1 drop to 100%, it is open to you. And I think socially for me, it is much the same. I have some siblings who are actually much more lightly complected than I am. They could be white passing. So they don't get racially profiled the same way that I do, even though we have the same experience, culturally, and the same kind of consciousness about who we are. So I think rather than being identity police, especially in our Indigenous communities, our values of inclusion and acceptance and, consensus and communalism, I think should govern the way we interact with one another. And certainly I try to live that in my own life. At the same time, I think with someone like Elizabeth Warren, I would have felt very differently. Like if she, as a white presenting Native woman, if she was interested in her Indigenous identity, culture, and wanted to come explore that, I'd be like, come to the ceremony, let's go. This is yours too. 1/3 of our people have been adopted and fostered out of our communities, and this is yours. You have a right to be here. I think the thing that got clunky with her is that her Indigenous identity was not so much in, something that she was interested in exploring so much as using for political advantage. And so it seemed like, it kind of felt like somebody saying some of my best friends are Black people, instead of just living it. And that using it as a shield rather than, a central part of consciousness. But at the same time, that doesn't make me feel like she's not actually Native. It was just unfortunate that it was politicized rather than, lived and explored. And when it comes to tribal enrollment, it's more complex. There you need, depends on the tribe, but most require you to prove a certain percentage of blood from that particular tribe. This is old eugenics kind of Nazi science stuff that I think we need to get rid of. But it's part of the political reality. And Native people, I think the trend, a lot more Native people want to see us do away with that than not. But there are concerns, like if we open up the doors to anybody who's ever had a drop of blood from this particular tribe, pretty soon those who stayed here, who kept the language and culture alive, are going to be tiny minorities of the tribal polity, and their ideas about what's important for a Native nation to do are going to be marginalized. And so those are some of the concerns and why change hasn't happened a little more quickly.
All right, so the last question. So Kat had asked a bunch of questions that fell within your answer. So I'm hoping that she was able to glean some answers from that. And the last question, and I want to ask this because 3 or 4 people alluded to the same person. Do you have any thoughts about the writings of Vine Deloria Jr.?
Oh yeah, Vine Deloria Jr. is one of the early Native kind of polemics who was out there, you know, writing books like Custer Died for Your Sins and God is Red and things like that. And his is a poignant voice. I got to meet Vine Deloria when he was still alive and doing his thing. And I think he's fantastic. You know, very thought-provoking, smart and informed. His son, Phil Deloria, actually is a historian and more of like an archival historian, but he's, you know, had some books like Playing Indian, you know, that are kind of connected to the work of his father. And yes, I mean, I've always been a fan of Deloria's work. It's provocative, and, you know, it was a great starting place. Right now, also of great excitement is that we just have hundreds of Native people who are writing and producing scholarship, and there are many, many voices out there. So it's really exciting to see it grow.
About that too, because you know that old African proverb, until the lion gets his historian, the tale of hunting will always glorify the hunter. So I am always excited when those of us who come from these populations are actually writing about our own people's experiences, theorizing about our own people, providing that kind of rich qualitative narrative, as opposed to what has been written about us before by people who are not a part of our societies, but just came and observed us. So we're at the end. I want to thank everyone who joined us from Ohio University and those of you who joined us from other places. I would also like to thank Dr. Dwayne Bruce, who is the Assistant Director in the Multicultural Center, who's always been so gracious in helping, making sure that all our tech needs are taken care of. And of course, Dr. Anton Treuer for his expertise in helping us understand and somewhat illumify some of what we want to know. Again, his information is in the chat. So there are, of course, like with every other group, many, many, many questions that we're still pondering over, which is good. And so at least, you know, there's a resource and there's somewhere that you can go to get this information. Thanks again. You all have a wonderful afternoon, and stay safe and mask up. Stay safe and mask up.
Right. Thank you, Winsome. Thank you, everybody, for joining.